Hi everyone, and welcome to our first Hiptest 101 webinar for SmartBear Academy. For this session, I'm happy to welcome Laurent, Director of Products, and Vincent, Senior Software Developer, who will host this webinar. So now it's time to Laurent to present you the
Thank you, Alan, and thanks for this introduction. So today we are here to talk about Hiptest. But before we dive in, I want to make sure everyone understands who is SmartBear and why we're here. So at SmartBear, we focus on providing software teams with easy-to-use tools, helping them to deliver the best software faster than ever. We have more than 6 million users across 194 countries. We have offices in the US, in Europe. So in Europe, it's Galway, Sweden, and now France with the Hiptest acquisition. We also have offices in Australia, so all over the world. At SmartBear, we are strong innovator and strong believer in open source with SoapUI, with Swagger, and now with Hiptest Publisher. So I will not get into all the details, but I want to share with you what I want to share with you now is the breadth of the SmartBear product portfolio, covering the entire software development lifecycle, from development to testing to operations across both the API and UI layer. We also have tools to support collaboration. So Hiptest is a collaborative testing platform, helping teams to collaborate on the ID, helping teams to test their code continuously, and we do support behavior-driven development. For teams that use the more traditional QA process and QA approach, we have QA Complete. So that's why we are here. We are here to help you get to the market faster with the product you actually imagine. So now let's start with Hiptest. So during this session, we'll see how Hiptest can help you define UIDs by creating meaningful tests, tests that are easy to read, tests that are easy to maintain. We'll also discuss the importance of reviewing and refactoring your tests continuously, especially if you want to scale your approach on large projects. And last but not least, we'll also see how to keep track of manual test execution. And we'll do a brief introduction. So Vincent will do it about test automation, automated testing. That will just be a brief introduction, but if you are interested in more details about how Hiptest can help you accelerate your transition to automated testing, how Hiptest can integrate with CI, and how we do support behavior-driven development, I strongly recommend you to attend the next session, so Hiptest 201, next week, next Tuesday. So just before we start the demo, I suggest that we have a very quick poll to understand how many of you have already used BDD, behavior-driven development, how many plan to start it in short term, in longer term, or you don't have plan yet to use BDD. So far we have, let's say 50% who have no plan yet to use BDD, and 50% that or use actually BDD or plan to use it in the future. Great. So let's start with the demo now. So we're going to share the screen. So for this demo, I will use a web application, the coffee machine. So everyone should be familiar with. So that's one of these coffee espresso machine that from time to time serves a great coffee, but let's say most of the time complains because they are missing beans, missing water, and so on and so forth. So that's a web application that we have created. You can switch on the machine. You can get some espresso, and we can see that the water tank is decreasing. Same thing for the grounds. So we have some business logic behind it. And inside Hiptest, so we have this project with a couple of test cases and scenarios that have been already created. So we have 14 scenarios in this case. This coffee machine examples is the one that we use also for different tutorials that are available inside the Hiptest community. So if you want to use these examples and play with it, you can just click create a project, and you will see in the list of example projects you have here the coffee machine. So Hiptest will generate for you this the project that we'll use today for the demo. And this project is being used, as I said, for 2 tutorials, getting started with BDD and integrating Hiptest with the CI in 5 minutes, no more. So that's it for this project. If we look now at the different existing scenarios and test cases that we have for this project, we can see, so we have a couple of existing scenarios. One that is the nominal scenario, served coffee. So that's the way you typically write a user story if you use the agile approach. So in order to get the benefits to enjoy the rest of the day as a coffee lover, that's the role. As a role, I do an action. In this case, I can get a coffee from the machine. So we have one simple scenario for it. Very basic scenario that is written using the gherkin syntax, so the BDD flavor. And during this demo, I will create 2 different scenarios, one using the BDD flavor, so the gherkin syntax, and one using the more traditional approach, so having a sequence of action, result, action, results. We also have a couple of scenarios describing the different errors here. So one for the beans, we can see the different use cases for the beans feature. So the message fill beans is displayed after 38 coffees. After 40 coffees, it is possible to take 40 coffees, but no more. And after 40 coffees, if we add beans to the machine, then the message fill beans should disappear. So yeah, the example seems pretty simple, but we quickly realize as we add more features, more use cases, that it can get very, very complex. So for this demo, we have already done 3 sprints, and now we are just about to start all together the 4th sprint. And for these 4 sprints, we'll have to implement 2 new features, and we'll have to test them. So the first feature that I want here to work on, so we will use JIRA for this demo to manage our different user stories. Just keep in mind that Hiptest integrates with JIRA, integrates with Trello, but with also many other web-based management tools. We just show JIRA here as more than 50% of our community use JIRA. So we can see that for the nominal scenario, served coffee, for this user story, we have one Hiptest scenario that is linked to it, which is served coffee. And we can see that this scenario has been executed as part of a test run, CI, and the test is run. So we'll get back to that in the demo. In our case, we want to implement and test a new feature, which is a warning is displayed. Warning is displayed when descaling is needed. So that's a new user story we have to test. So we can see here that so far we have no scenario linked to it. So let's go back in Hiptest and let's create our first scenario together. So the first thing I will do is create one folder that will contain potentially many scenarios in the display error feature. So let's create descaling folder. And as part of this folder, descaling, I will create a new scenario named descaling is needed after 500 coffees. So in Hiptest, we typically recommend to organize your project using folders, subfolders, representing the different business processes and the different features of your application. This way, it makes it very easy for the team, not just the QA guys, but also developers, product owners, or business users, even the marketing, I would say, to understand what does the product. In this case, we can clearly see for the coffee machine that we have the nominal scenario, which is serve coffee, but we can also see we support multiple languages. The machine can be configured, and we have to deal with a couple of errors like the beans, grounds, water, descaling now, and we have also one scenario for bad usage. So without diving into all the different test cases and steps, I start to have the first understanding about the behavior of my application. So now we have created our first scenario. It's empty. I have no step. I'm just going to link this scenario with the JIRA user story. So you will see it's very simple. We just do drag and drop. So I pick up my scenario. I drop it here in this in the plugin area, and I click link. And what I can see here directly inside JIRA is that my user story, a warning is displayed when descaling is needed, has been linked to this scenario. So I have one scenario, one Hiptest scenario linked to this user story. And just by clicking here, I can go back to my scenario, and I can see here that automatically, in real time, we have created a link in our scenario. So I know from Hiptest that descaling is needed after 500 coffees is linked to my JIRA user story. I can just click here and navigate back to JIRA. So now let's start with the steps. As I said earlier, I will write the first scenario using the BDD flavor, so using the Gherkin syntax. So let's start by the context. So given the coffee machine is started, and what you can see here is that as I'm writing my step, I got a couple of suggestions here. One being the coffee machine is started. So here I'm going to reuse this step instead of writing it in a different ways. That's one of the features that is loved by your community, the autocomplete feature. As you write steps, when we have something that exists or that is close to what you write, we suggest you to reuse these steps. We call these action words. These action words, the reusable steps, define the business terminology of your project, and you create user scenarios using this business terminology. So in the context, I will also make sure that I handle water tank. I continue, and I want to make sure I handle all the exceptions except descaling. So I handle beans, and I handle ground. So what you can see here is that reusing existing steps also speed up the design process. Not only it helps you to create scenarios using a consistent business terminology, but also it helps you to speed up the design process. So I'm done for the context. I've created the context. Then when I take when I take, and here I'm going to reuse a step that has a parameter. So 500 coffees. So you can see here that a step can have some parameters. Then, and that's the outcome, that's my check. Then a warning, machine, coffee machine, sorry. Coffee machine need to be descaled. Is displayed. So that's it. What you can see here is that I have no suggestions. The reason is we have no steps that exist or that is close to what I've defined here. So I have basically a couple of options here. I can create a new action word, so a new reusable step, or I could create just an action or a result, which is what we'll see in the next scenario we will create, which is the more traditional way to create you test cases. So in this case, I will create an action word. So I will make this step reusable. Next time someone will write a warning, for example, he will have the suggestions and he will be able, as you can see here, and he will be able to reuse it. So that's it. We've created our first scenario together, reusing existing steps, creating a new one, defining or extending, let's say, our business terminology. One thing I also want to add is, because this is part of the sprint 4, so I want to make sure I use the tag sprint 4, maybe this way, sprint 4. So that next time we'll want to filter all the scenarios related to sprint 4. We'll be able to do it easily. So that's it for the first scenario. Now we're going to see other interesting concept for those of you who use BDD or plan to use it. So let's go to the serve coffee machine, and I will show you how you can very easily refactor your step. The interesting thing with the action words, so that defines your shared language, your business terminology, is not only it makes all your scenarios, all your test cases written in a consistent way, but an action word also represents a single point of maintenance. So it means that if you make a modification to this reusable step, all the scenarios that use it will be impacted automatically. So for example, here, for the simple scenario, given the coffee machine is started, when I take a coffee, coffee should be served. Let's say now we want to, as part of this new sprint, add different type of coffees. So for example, now we want the user to be able to select between a lungo, an espresso, or a ristretto. So basically we have different kinds of coffee. I can just click here, navigate to my step. So I take a coffee. I can see, by the way, the list of all the action words. So the list of all the steps that defines my business terminology. And in this case, for this step, I will add a parameter. So type of coffee. So just by doing this, I've added a parameter. I can add a default value for the parameter. So I can say the default value is an espresso. And the interesting thing here is that all the scenarios that were using this step, I take a coffee, are now have been impacted automatically by the modification, the update we've done. So if I go back to the scenario simple use, what we can see here is that now my step has a parameter with a default value, and for this particular scenario, I can change the default value and say, in this case, I want a ristretto. And that's it. in just a second, I've been able to impact 3 scenarios. Of course, in this case, that's a very simple project, but just imagine in a real-life project, we have customers that have thousands of scenarios, one step being used by thousands of scenarios. You just modify it, you rename it, or you add a parameter as we've done here, and in a flash, all your thousands of scenarios are modified instantly. So that's it for the refactoring part. If you use BDD, but that's also true if you don't, there is one thing that is interesting when you want a couple of scenarios of the same feature that share, let's say, a similar setup. So you have, in this case here, a field setup that enables you to add one or more steps. And these steps, so in this case, given the coffee machine is started and I handle everything except the beans, all these steps will be added to your scenarios here. So instead of creating duplications and adding these 2 steps in all the scenarios, you can create a setup for a feature, so for the beans feature, that will be shared by all the scenarios of this feature. So here again, the idea of the setup is to use or reuse existing steps, so the action words when it's possible, and we'll see for the living documentation. The idea behind that is that Hiptest is more than just a check. The test should support the conversation between all the stakeholders, so between the QA team, between developers, product owners, and also business users. So that's it for our first and simple scenario. You've seen that we have created the descaling scenario. We have done also some refactoring. So we are done with this first feature. Now we're going to implement a second user story. And for this one, I will use the more traditional way to create scenarios, so which is shut down the machine. It's pretty strange that after 3 sprints, we're still not able to shut down the machine. So I think we need to fix that. So I will create a new feature, which is shut down. And as part of this feature, I'm going to create a new scenario, which is shut down the coffee machine. So for this scenario, I can add a tag the same way. I can link it to a JIRA user story exactly the same way I did before. And here I'm going to create the steps using the more traditional approach. So I can simply say press on/off button to start the machine. So that's an action in this case. Simple action. Then I can say check that the machine is started, and that's a result. Next action is press the on/off button, so the second time. And here I can say check that the machine is shut down. And that's a result. So that's a sequence of action, result, action, result. Typically for this kind of test, the execution will be a manual execution. And there is still an interesting capabilities that you can leverage with Hiptest, which is the refactoring features. There is no big difference between teams using BDD, using the Gherkin syntax, or teams using more traditional approach. The idea of every single test that you create, this test should be meaningful. It should be easy to understand by the other stakeholders of the project. So the idea of creating you test with a consistent business terminology makes sense, either you do or not BDD. So in this case, one of the feature that we do provide is the ability for you to progressively create action words from existing steps. So let's say in this case, we have an action, press on off button to start the machine. If I want to convert this step into an action word, I can just select it, press convert into action word, and then I can give a name to the action word, and my step, my action, or my result, if I select a result, will be converted into an action word. So next time someone will write shut down the coffee machine, or shut down, just shut down, he will have the suggestion, he will be able to reuse it. And there is one cool thing that Hiptest can help you with. If you have already created a lot of duplications, so you have already, let's say, 100 test cases that use the shut down the coffee machine step. When you do this kind of refactoring, Hiptest analyzes all your projects or all your scenarios and suggests to apply the refactoring to all your existing test cases. So here again, in just a flash, you can avoid duplication and create one single point of maintenance. And the next step will be if you have to modify the name of the action word, or if you have to add a parameter, you'll be able to do it very easily. So that's the two ways that you can use to define your test cases and create your scenario in Hiptest: the traditional way, or let's say using the BDD flavor. So that's it for the first part of the demo. I guess now it's time for Vincent to kick in and to execute the test. Just before that, we have a second poll for you to know if you execute your tests mainly manually today, or if you execute them, or if you use automated testing. And in case you use automated testing, do you run your tests locally, or do you run them on the cloud?
So apparently lots of people use mix of manual and automated checks, almost 75%, nice score. 13% only do manual testing, and also 13% run them in the cloud. So for this part, second part of the demo, we are going to focus on the execution of the test. So we are going to cover both manual execution and automated one. So as Lauren mentioned before, we started sprint 4. We've added the 2 new scenarios, so it's time, of course, to run them. We'll skip the part where the developers really do the code, of course. So for the test execution, this takes place in the test part of Hiptest, obviously. So as I mentioned, we started sprint 4. So let's create a new test run that will be dedicated to this specific sprint. And this will be the manual testing. So with lots of imagination, we are going to call that sprint 4. So when you create a test run, you've got multiple choices. First one is to use all the test cases, which could be doable, of course, in a small project like that, but might be harder on thousands of different tests. Second use case is you can decide to clone the selection from a previous test run. So here, for example, I could say, okay, I'm going to take exactly the same test that I had for sprint 3. This is typically the case when you have a test run dedicated to the regression test that you want to play at every sprint or iteration. Or you can manually filter the test you are going to select. There's basically 2 ways to do so. So first, by using the folder structure. So I want to test, obviously, the serve coffee one, because it's definitely the best scenario in all these projects. I could say, okay, I want to check the languages or the new scenarios we created just before. The other way to filter is to use the different tags. So here, for example, I want to say, okay, I want all the scenarios that have the sprint 4 tag. Oops, sorry. Let's do it again. So if I apply this filter, not really surprisingly, of course, we have only one scenario currently using it. So with the tags and the folder, it's really easy to select the test you are going to execute. So here we're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4 tests. Okay, let's just add a bit like those ones. 6 tests will be enough for the demo. One thing to note here, you can select either the tags you've put on the folders or the ones you have at the scenario level. So let's create our test run now. Right now, what you are seeing with the we are populating your test run, what Hiptest has been doing pretty quickly is copying all the scenarios, all the action word, all the folder inside the test run. So in this case, especially when you have really long execution time, people can skip working on the scenarios, the folder, the action word, preparing the next sprint, for example, without impacting the work of the manual testers. So right now we've got our different scenarios and obviously we want to execute them. Before executing, we may want to do some planification. So assigning the different tests to our users. So for example, I'm going to take the test for serving the coffee because I love the coffee, of course. I could say, for example, all the tests about message translation will have to be run by Orlane, and Laurent will play with the configuration of the coffee machine. It's kind of a geeky one, so it's going to be his test.
I would prefer to test the simple use. I got a coffee.
Yeah, but that's my test. So we got our test now, and we have done the planification, so we know who executes which test. So it's time to run them. So to run them, this is done in this resume test window, and here you get a really focused way to execute your test. The execution can be done in 2 ways. The first one is you play your test and you add, let's say, a global status to the test. So let's say this one is passed. I can go to the next test. We also have some shortcuts like passed and next. So it's going to set the status to passed and go to the next one. Obviously, we can also have different status, like this test has failed, for example. When a test has failed, of course, you can add some comments. This will help people understand what happened and why did you mark this test as failed. You can add attachments like screenshots or anything that can be helpful when debugging the problem you raised. And you can also create a JIRA issue. So here we got this Hiptest project linked to the webinar coffee machine project in JIRA that we saw here. And here I have also the possibility to create a new bug, but of course I could select the type of issue I create with a summary, a description. And if you have configured your JIRA with a mandatory field, like I want to assign directly to someone, for example, they will be displayed directly in this view, so you don't have to get back to JIRA, create it, and link the test. I won't create it, but you get the idea. The second way to execute the test is do some step-by-step execution. So here you can see the different status for each step in the scenario, and simply clicking on it will set its status. So if I click once, every test, if I click once on a step, it's marked as passed. So here, as all the steps have passed, the test is passed. And let's say this one failed. Of course, as soon as one step is failed, the full test is marked as failed. So I'm just going to end this execution. So here we've done all the tests have been executed, so I can close the execution cycle. What we mean by close the execution cycle is take all the results and store them in a build. So this way, we know that all those results belong to the same execution. Let's say a day, half a day have passed and the developers have done their work and fixed all the bugs. So we can say, okay, it's still sprint 4. Let's start a new test session. This time I'm going to go really fast and just mark everything as passed. So we'll have all our tests done. And this way, now it's marked, we have the test marked all as green. And if we go to the homepage dashboard of this test run, we can see also the execution history for this specific sprint. So we know that first time we had 2 failing tests and 5 passed, and now everything is passed. One thing we could also do with this test run dedicated to manual testing, we could say, okay, this sprint 4, is the current sprint. So we could say, I want to have it on the project dashboard. So this way, when someone arrives on the project, we can see the status for the sprint 4, and I can remove sprint 3, which is the old sprint now. And we have the cumulative statuses on all the test run. So the one from the sprint and the one from the CI. Of course, when we created the descaling test, we've linked it to the JIRA issue. So the test generated from this test run is also linked to the JIRA issue. And now, if I click on the descaling tag, so it reopens the original JIRA issue, we will be able to see here in just a few seconds that for sprint 4, this test is now passed. So you've got a direct communication with the dev team, for example, where they directly see the status of the manual test. But of course, they will see the status for the one run by the CI. So when you want to have a CI, obviously, you will need to automate your test. And this is done using Hiptest Publisher that you can see here. So here, what you see exactly is Hiptest Publisher as a service. So it's the web version of Hiptest Publisher, and it's really useful when you want to really bootstrap the automation of your test. So let's say we want to start automating our test using Java JUnit. So I simply click there, make some space in my download folder. And here we're going to get a few different files. What's really interesting is first the test, of course. So here we have all our tests by default generated in a single file just to ensure it works out of the box. But of course, it's possible to configure Hiptest Publisher to tweak a bit the output and keep the hierarchy you have in Hiptest. And here we get all our tests generated. And if you're a bit familiar with Java or any language, in fact, what you may see is that all our tests are in fact just calling functions on an object called action word. And that's where this comes really interesting. Let's have a look to those action words. So here you will see that each action word that was written in the project became one function in the code. And as Lauren mentioned, an action word is a single point of maintenance in your project. And it's also a single point of automation in your code. So here, it's where the automation team will kick in and fill in the blanks. So they will replace this code with, for example, some Selenium code to test a website, maybe linked with CVT. They can use Appium to test a mobile application. You can use some curl command or SOAP UI to test an API. It's completely up to the team. The only thing you need to do, of course, is keep the name of the function. And what's really interesting, as I said, it's a single point of automation. So the more you reuse existing and automated action word, the less work you have to do to get your test up and running. In the example scenario Lauren wrote just before, if we consider that the tests were automated before, there was 7 steps in this scenario, 6 or 7, somewhere like this. It just created one new action word. So to get the full scenario automated, just one action word needed to be automated. So the more you reuse action word, the less work you have to do. If you're interested in a more detailed approach about, or at least detailed demo about the automation, I invite you to join Hiptest 201. So I'm just giving an overview of it right now. once the tests have been automated, of course, you may want to have them run in a CI with a CI tool, and you will want to have this CI tool linked with Hiptest. So to do so, you will create a test run dedicated to the CI. So contrary to the other test run, which are, let's say, have a pretty short lifespan, one test run for each sprint, the CI test run will live as long as the project lives. And this test run, this one you started as soon as you've got automated test. Once again, it lives as long as the project, and you will add scenarios when you start automating them. You can easily add scenario there. So let's consider we did a good work on automating descaling. So we can add it to the test run like this. And if I want to have this test run linked with a CI tool, the only thing I have to do is go to this automate button here and copy those 3 command lines to the configuration of my CI tool. So the 2 first one will be executed before running the test. They will basically use Hiptest Publisher to regenerate the test file. So this way you ensure you execute the correct version of the test. And the last one will push the results back to Hiptest to give the status of the different tests. We support currently those 6 different formats. And here, for example, we can see the CI has been run a few different times since the creation of this project. One last thing I want to show, but for this, I just need to enable the BDD mode in this project. And as soon as I have this BDD mode automated, you will see a new menu has appeared here in the last and third section of Hiptest, which is called Learn, and it's the living documentation. So here, a living documentation is a way to share the work of the team based on the scenario. So it's a place where you can really easily discuss the scenario that have been written. It's a easier way to read them. For example, here, if we have a look at the beans section, we can see that all the scenarios appear in a single place. We've got the background displayed directly in the same place. And so it's really a place where you can share your work, the work of the dev team, the work of the QA team. You can say, okay, on the CI today, these are the tests that have been run. And if you have behind that a CD pipeline after the CI process, this will reflect the true state of the application. You also have the possibility to have some history about the different feature. So here we can see that there is quite a long history on this beans feature. So it will show when the dev and QA team started working on the feature, when new scenarios have been added, or some scenarios have been updated with new versions. You also have the possibility to create digests. If I click on the correct place. So here we can see in the last 2 weeks, we've had a few new features added to the CI branch, like descaling, not really surprising because we did that just before. We have the list of features that have been updated, and we also have some features that have been removed. You may wonder why descaling has been added and removed. It's simple. We did some rehearsal of this 101 before, and it was using this project. So there was yesterday another descaling feature that was added. And this feature can also be, this digest part can be used on longer time spans. Like, for example, what we do at Hiptest is prior to each semester meeting, we can have a look to, okay, what did we do in the last 3 months? Of course, this project is pretty young, so the result is the same. But we know that in the last 3 months, we worked on those new features, and these are the ones that have been deployed in production.
So yeah, and I could also mention, Vincent, that for the retrospective that we do, we use the same. So last 2 weeks, what have we done? And we can see the list of all the scenarios that have been implemented and executed, so meaning all the features that we have deployed in production. And here, this living documentation, this is one of the great outcomes of the teams using BDD, and it's the big difference between I do BDD and I don't. And it's all about collaboration. So when using BDD, doesn't mean you have to automate the test. It doesn't mean you have to execute the Gherkin syntax. It's a mindset. It means that before starting development, before investing $1 in implementing, coding a feature, I make sure I collaborate. So QA, developers, business users, product guys, and marketing. I make sure that using some examples, using some scenarios and test cases, all together, we create a shared understanding of the feature. So we consider a test case, either you call that a test case or scenarios. We consider it as not only a check, it's also a way to drive development. It's also a way to create shared understanding. And in this case, because the test has been automated and is being executed as part of the CI/CD pipeline, it was kind of the specification for the feature, but it's also the documentation of the feature. So that's the value of using BDD. So Hiptest is flexible. We do support the different approaches, from just agile test management, executing new tests manually, and also using BDD and automating them. It's a long journey. We don't wake up in the morning and say, okay, now we'll use BDD. It took us something like 3 years to get it right. And now we deploy continuously in production. So we deploy 5 to 10 times a day in production. We use BDD to drive our development and to document our platform or product. But it's kind of a long journey. So that's it for this demo. I think it's time now to start with the questions. So we have already 2 questions. One of them, Deepesh, related to the parameters. So how do we create parameters? If I just go back to the example I've shown before, serve coffee, what you've seen is that just by adding, so in this step, I take a ristretto coffee. Just by adding, using this syntax or going directly here and adding a new parameter, you can add a parameter to the step. One thing also that is interesting with parameters is data tables. So no, I think it's multiple languages. So if I look at this feature, we support multiple languages. We have 2 different scenarios. If I pick up this one, messages are based on language. So this one uses a data table. So you can basically define multiple data sets for one given scenarios. So here we have one data set for the English. So the ready message should be ready. And for the French, the message should be prêt. And for these 2 different languages, so we have 2 data sets. When executing the test, either manually or automatically, Hiptest will generate, for this single scenario, we generate 2 tests, one for the English and one for the French. And this is the way you use the parameter of the data table and the scenario inside the step. So instead of assigning a value, like I did for a ristretto, instead of the default value, here you can just write equal to the language, so the parameter of your data table, and here equal to the name of the parameter, ready message. Hiptest will generate automatically the 2 tests. We have another question, Vincent, that is related to the automation part. So when we generate the action word list, it's all in one file, but of course for huge projects like Hiptest, by the way, it can be hard to manage. So is it possible to split the file into multiple ones?
Yeah, so that will mainly depend on the language you use. For example, with let's say flexible languages such as Python, Ruby, JavaScript, which supports multiple inheritance, mixins, and things like that, it's fairly easy to do it. With more, let's say, strict languages like Java, C#, what we tend to console is to use the action word class as an indirection layer that will point, for example, behind it to different classes, like they can reflect, for example, the page object pattern or things like that. So in that case, yeah, it's going to be one single file, but each function will be a single line of code. That said, one of the things we are working on is the possibility to, let's say, sort or order. I'm not sure what the correct word is.
Organize.
Organize, thanks. The action words in a folder structure like we do for the scenarios. So in that case, obviously, as soon as the action words are organized by folders in Hiptest, this structure will be reflected in the different classes where the action words will be generated. Which makes me think about the code. One thing I forgot to mention, Laurent mentioned when the coffee machine example. So it's an example you can regenerate easily in Hiptest using so this menu. We also, for all of the languages we support with Hiptest Publisher, we've got some projects called HPS something. So HPS stands for Hiptest Publisher Sample. And for all of them, we have an implementation of the coffee machine and some automation, well, some full automation of all the action word. And this is linked to a CI with Travis CI. So you can really quickly start getting your test automated with this project.
So one question, and a couple of questions. So one is related to JIRA. Do we get the result updated in JIRA? So the answer is yes. This is what we've shown before. Just by doing one drag and drop, when you execute this scenario as part of a test run, you will see automatically the result of the test run inside JIRA. So that works for every issues or every user stories you have created links for, and you also have the opportunity to see the traceability metrics for your project. So if we go to the report page, you have one that is Hiptest traceability metrics. And what you can see here is so the list of all the user stories, issues of your project. So here it is, and the different scenarios. So or folders, so features user story is linked with, and the statuses coming from a manual test run or automated test run. So we can see that for the user story we have worked on together, a warning is displayed when the scaling is needed. We've linked this scenario automatically. As we have executed the test manually as part of sprint 4, we can see the result. Same thing for the CI. So it means that next time Jenkins executes the test, the result will be pushed automatically in Hiptest and will be updated automatically in JIRA. With JIRA, we have a real-time integration, so it means you don't have any duplication of data. It's very simple and flexible integration. We have also other questions related to the automation part. So regarding SOAP UI or Selenium. So as Vincent mentioned, but we'll share more details next week during the Hiptest 201 session, the advanced one. So it is possible to implement every single action words, every single steps using at the GUI level. So you can use Selenium WebDriver for that. If it's at the API level, you can use typically SOAP UI. So yes, that's possible. It's also possible once you have automated you test using Selenium WebDriver, for example, to execute these tests with CBT. So we start to have these integrations with other SmartBear products in the portfolio, like CBT, Test Complete, and also SOAP UI.
Yeah, and during the 201, the demo will be partly done with CBT. So we're going to show the execution of the test on this coffee machine with cross-browser testing.
And during this demo, we've shown the integration with JIRA because it's the leader today. But of course, Hiptest integrates with many other solutions. So I mentioned Trello, but basically it works with all the web-based tools. So it works with Redmine. We have customers that use Hiptest with Redmine. And yeah, as I said, any other web project management tool. So we can show here the way it works.
Yeah. So basically, it's going to work. So the status of the test in Hiptest will be reflected in, for example, Redmine using badges. So a bit like what you would have with Travis CI and loads of different CI tool, for example. So let's say I'm going to take this test. I can simply generate a tag. It's going to look like this. Select the different markups, and I can copy paste that to Redmine to generate a link to the test in Redmine. And the other way around, if I get back here, what I can do is create what we call tag linkers. So it's going to work a bit like the JIRA tags, but instead of having a key JIRA, it may be GitHub or whatever. But will make automated links to your issue tracker or UALM or any web-based tool you want to use.
So we have many other questions, but we'll not be able to answer because we are running out of time. I will make sure we answer all the questions by email later. Just before ending this webinar, so we have one last poll for you. Arlene?
So here is the poll regarding the webinar. So please rate it if you like it or not. Please let us our feedback, and feel free to send us an email if you have any other question. We'll be able to answer to you. And thank you, Vincent. Thank you, Lauren, for this webinar, and thank you to everyone.